title of my paper is The Paradoxical Nature of Kierkegaard's Ethics of Love. I want to kind of focus, first of all, on the first deliberation, where Kierkegaard tells us that true love originates from a hidden or secret place. He writes that God's love, as the eternal wellspring of eternal love, rests in the innermost being of every individual. And from this hidden or mysterious place flows the life of love. Kierkegaard describes two different forms of love in his analysis of the royal love in Deliberation 2, A, B, and C. Here he makes a clear distinction, and I just want to say distinction, between what he names neighborly love and preferential love. However, that in essence, there is only one kind of love. So it's just a distinction. The one true love, which is the Spirit's love. This form of love, being infinite, is unrestricted. Kierkegaard claims that his claim is that this infinite form of love is universal and transformative, and it's all-inclusive when it lies at the base of every other expression of love. In Works of Love, Kierkegaard is arguing that love as neighborly love is an all-inclusive or universal form of love, which makes no distinction between me and all others. This is because neighborly love only recognizes what makes us all the same. In Deliberation 2c, Kierkegaard states that what makes us all the same is eternity's mark on every man. Eternity's mark being the Spirit's love, which flows from the wellspring of eternal love into a hidden reservoir which lies deep inside every individual. This hidden place, as Kierkegaard tells us, which is overflowing with the Spirit's love, is the very source of our desire to love. According to Kierkegaard, it's from this hidden, mysterious place that the life of love flows. Kierkegaard's use of deliberations in this work is highly significant because a deliberation calls us to reflect on the subject matter. And in true Socratic fashion, it's to provoke our thought, and it's intended to awaken us as the reader or the listener from our comfortable and often confused way of thinking. This paper will argue that what Kierkegaard is showing us through his series of deliberations in Works of Love is how to see ourselves and every other as the neighbor, which entails unequivocally recognizing all people as equals before the law and before God. And of course, he's telling us much more than just this. The problem that this paper wants to address is the paradoxical nature of Kierkegaard's ethics of love, which one can argue is both inclusive and exclusive. As the expression of love's law, as I will argue, it's all inclusive. Yet being a Christian form of ethics means that those who are not Christian may feel excluded. So paradoxically, whilst Kierkegaard's universal and transformative form of love is all inclusive, his ethics of love by its very nature as a Christian form of ethics seems to be exclusive. So what are we to make of the paradoxical nature of Kierkegaard's ethics as a Christian or religious form of ethics? Can we reconcile Kierkegaard's all-inclusive call to love every man as our neighbor, based on our shared interest to love the other, with what Harry S. Brodie and others see as the exclusive nature of his ethics of love? The major thesis of this paper will endeavor to respond to Brodie's problem, which in general terms can be understood as the problem of exclusion and religious partiality in Kierkegaard's philosophy. The minor thesis of this paper will argue that the tensions, dilemmas, and paradoxes that arise within Kierkegaard's analysis of works of love must be accepted and respected on the basis that, contrary to his pseudonymous works of love is written in his own name. And I will argue that it's for this reason and many more too, that these tensions and the works itself must be let stand as it now stands. In the article Kierkegaard's Levels of Existence, Harry S. Brodie writes that to adopt the theological considerations upon which Kierkegaard's philosophy is based is to deny that millions upon millions of human beings are able to exemplify the higher forms of existence. The major thesis of this paper will present two possible ways of responding to the challenge of exclusion or religious partiality in Kierkegaard's works of love. A, by questioning and attempting to redefine the necessity for a command to love, and B, by suggesting that the command to love or the royal law could be presented in secular terms by being explained just simply as love's law. The major thesis, redefining the necessity for a command to love. While it's true to say that God's command to love everyone equally as the neighbor is the core of Kierkegaard's works of love, and whilst it's taken for granted that divine commands impose obligations, obligatory love can be represented as either commanded by a divine lawgiver, God, or demonstrated by a divine exemplar, Jesus Christ, as the Son of God. With regard to the latter, and speaking in philosophical terms, perhaps we need to explore the possibility of seeing love as the object of ethics, and love, that is Jesus's love, rather than Christianity, Jesus's Christianity, as the object of faith. With regard to the former, as was stated in the opening paragraphs of this paper, Kierkegaard states in the first deliberation of works of love that every individual's love originates in God's love, and that this gift of love manifests itself as a deep need which longs to be expressed. The question is, if this form of love needs to be expressed and we're all free to express it as Kierkegaard suggests, then why must we be commanded to love? With the support of deliberation one, perhaps one could argue that it's because the love which originates in God is by its very nature infinite and eternal, and that a command to love may be the only way to make it understandable in finite terms, that is, by means of language. In other words, language may be the only way to make the infinite nature of love and our intense desire to love understandable in rational terms. Keeping deliberation one in mind, perhaps the command to love merely presupposes the gift of infinite love from God, which is the source of our deep desire to love. And because, like God, this form of love is hidden, the only way that it can be revealed or discovered by us is by being nudged to actively respond to the command to love others the way that God loves us. So there are two ways of softening this idea of the command to love, but ironically, Kierkegaard puts forward his own argument against the necessity to command to love, for a command to love. He argues that the reason that people should not need to be commanded to love all others is because God loves us first. What this means is that our desire to love can simply be understood as a response to God's infinite love for us. He states all the way in the conclusion of works of love that the commandment is that you shall love. But if you will understand yourself and life, then it seems that it should not need to be commanded, because to love people is the only thing worth living for. And without this love, you're not really living. What this part of the analysis is endeavoring to show is that the necessity for a command to love others could be understood philosophically as a means to an end. One, to make what is unintelligible intelligible. Two, to reveal what's hidden deep within us. Or three, to ignite a response to the recognition of God's infinite and eternal love for each one of us. Within this framework of understanding, the command to love could be understood as a beacon that guides us in how we should love. A beacon that guides us to love in a way that does not restrict neighborly love as an infinite form of love by merely loving preferentially. According to Kierkegaard, loving in a neighborly manner requires the natural expression of love towards family and friends as finite love to undergo a transformation process, which is named eternity's change. The transformation of the eternal eradicates all elements of selfishness from our expressions or our works of love. Now, this is the transformation of selfish self-will into either the good will in terms of self-denial or ultimately the will of God, thereby transforming finite love into infinite loving duty. For Kierkegaard, neighborly love as infinite love or the Spirit's love should be the bedrock that all of our preferential relationships are built upon. He writes, Christianity knows only one kind of love, the Spirit's love, but this can be at the base of and be present in every other expression of love. So the reclamation of eternal love is really the internal transformation of finite or restricted love, maybe possibly on the aesthetic level of existence, into infinite or unrestricted love in terms of ethical, religious levels. This proper, as opposed to selfish love of the self, now encompasses the love for God and for all others. It is the outward expression of my love for God through my works of love as neighborly love. God as the middle term in all of our relationships means that God's command of what is good ought to be the standard for what we should do for the other, but also the standard for what we expect the others to do for us. Because one thing that we have to remember is there's parity here. It's everybody's duty to love the neighbor. So this form of ethical religious reflection, which takes place in the space between the ethical and religiousness I think it reflects Johannes de Silencio's description in Fear and Trembling of winning one's eternal consciousness, which he explains, one, as loving God, and two, the last stage before true faith. This movement, as de Silencio explains, is purely a philosophical movement. And under this description, it's a movement that's open to everyone. While this is surely optimistic in terms of being inclusive, As a movement from the ethical to religiousness, this form of rational inclusivity may still not be considered to be a satisfactory solution to the non-Christian. However, in terms of ethics and religiousness this form of neighborly love is, on the surface at least, an outward relatedness to all others. So the other solution that I was wanting to offer in terms of to the charge of exclusivity and religious partiality is the presentation of the royal law as love's law or a universal law. As a Christian form of ethics, Kierkegaard's ethics is grounded in the royal law, Matthew 5:21-48, the second commandment, which states you shall love your neighbor as yourself. In secular terms, the royal law as love's law could be understood as the universal call to love. So, and in other words, it could be understood as the universal call which endeavors to move our loving duty to all people into loving practical action or works of love. Love's law could be understood as a universal directive that brings to light every individual's freedom as the opportunity to put this natural need to love others into action. In Love's Grateful Striving, a commentary on Kierkegaard's works of love, Jamie Ferreira represents Kierkegaard's deliberation 2, A, B, and C, which focuses on different elements of the royal law or the command to law. She does this in universal language and she calls it love's law. Ferreira's analysis of deliberation 2, which I would argue is the framework of Kierkegaard's works of love, highlights the distinction that Kierkegaard is making within the love command itself in order to reveal three ethical concepts which together highlight our equal connection to each other and to God. What Ferreira manages to successfully show is that the tripartite nature of love's law, as it's presented by Kierkegaard in Deliberation 2, reveals three key ethical concepts: A, obligation or duty; B, equality; and C, kinship or brotherhood. Each of these ethical concepts represent Kierkegaard's second deliberation in universal, secular, or relatable language. By Ferreira representing or pulling out these ethical concepts in such a clear manner, that is obligation, equality, and kinship or brotherhood, she's actually making these concepts. She's representing Kierkegaard's concepts in a very universal, secular, or if you would just want to say basically relatable language. And this is important because by raising this veil of Christianity, I would argue that love's law can now be understood in relation to the Kantian idea of willing the good. So Kierkegaard's understanding of neighborly love, like Kant's concept of the good will, can be understood as good without qualification, as something that has full value in and of itself. Love's law, like the concept of Kant's willing the good, can now be understood as the explication of the ontological relation and ethical duty of each human being to love every other. And this ethical, universal, and all-inclusive understanding of love, I would argue, is the very foundation of Kierkegaard's philosophy. In the foreword to Works of Love, George Pattison highlights the Kantian aspect of Kierkegaard's project, that is, his insistence on the disinterested nature of neighborly love. That is, the requirement for purity of intention or selflessness in our expression of this form of love. It is in this sense that Kierkegaard's notion of love relates closely to what Kant calls willing the good. Implicit in Kierkegaard's description of neighborly love, as Pattison writes, is the Kantian idea that even if I bring about a good outcome for the other, it can only be regarded as a work of love if I did it in love, that is, with the intention of love. My point is that fundamentally the relation between Kierkegaard's concept of neighborly love and Kant's concept of goodwill is a compatible one on the ethical religious level of existence. So it's on the ethical religious level of existence, that is the space between ethical existence and religiousness that I would argue that the relation between Kierkegaard's concept of true love as neighborly love in his works of love and Kant's concept of willing the good in his grounding for the metaphysics of morals are compatible. This shows in response to Brodie's charge of exclusion that by borrowing Ferreira's terminology, love's law could be read as an ethical call to love our neighbor and even our enemy. It is certainly the call to love all others. It's in this sense that Kierkegaard's ethics of love could be interpreted as a universal form of ethics because it's calling me to love all others. What this ethical call to love all people leaves out, however, is the origin and the necessity of this deep desire and infinite capacity to love, which was outlined by Kierkegaard, or is outlined by him in Deliberation 1. In Deliberation 2c, Kierkegaard is clearly arguing for the idea that neighborly love is an all-inclusive form of love, which makes no distinction between me and all others, and only recognizes what makes us all the same. Kierkegaard writes, every human being is the neighbor. In being king, beggar, rich man, poor man, male, female, we are not like each other. Therein, we are indeed different. But in being the neighbor, we are all unconditionally like each other. Dissimilarity is temporality's method of confusing that marks every human being differently, but the neighbor is eternity's mark on every human being. So according to Kierkegaard, what makes us all the same is eternity's mark on every human being. So once again, we are moving away from a universal form of ethics to a clearly defined Christian form of ethics. This is because eternity's mark is God's infinite and eternal love for each one of us, a form of love which reveals both our equality and our kinship in the eyes of God. So in truth, neighbor is eternity's mark on every human being. Neighbor is our equal connection to each other and to God. Neighbor being the ontological relation of human beings to one another as creations of God, making us all equal in God's eyes. Interestingly, Kierkegaard's concept of God as immanence or religiousness is compatible with Kant's rational understanding of religion. Kant's broader view of moral philosophy, the idea that morality leads ineluctably to religion, secures a firm connection between morality and religion. However, while Kierkegaard may have been inspired by what he regards as the broader religious view that Kantian ethics entails, he ultimately rejects any attempt to reduce religion to morality or to confine faith within the limits of rationality. Kierkegaard rejects the supremacy of reason. In the concluding unscientific postscript, his author Climacus writes, in existence, thought is by no means higher than imagination and feeling, but a coordinate. In existence, the supremacy of thought becomes confusing. So what we are faced with in works of love is Kierkegaard's ambivalence towards Kantian ethics, that is, his confirmation and rejection of Kant's systematic formulation of ethics. Contrary to Kant's view of God and the man of faith being restricted to the moral law, Kierkegaard's author De Silencio argues in Fear and Trembling that faith's paradox is this, that the single individual is higher than the universal. He determines his relation to the universal through his relation to the absolute, not his relation to the absolute through his relation to the universal. Considering Kierkegaard's Christian ethics as the foundation of the movement from a rational form of religion, religiousness A, to religiousness B, means that his Christian ethics and religiousness A together can be seen as the very foothold of the movement from an immanent form to an immanent or rational form of religion to a transcendent one. It's from this foothold that the individual quite literally takes the rational risk of the leap of faith, the movement to infinity. Of course, it is in Fear and Trembling that De Silencio reveals faith as this paradox, that interiority is higher than exteriority, which is precisely the idea that the single individual is higher than the universal. However, the acceptance of the paradox of faith as the individual's absolute duty to God, which entails the possibility of suspending the ethical for a higher telos than the ethical, is precisely, as Johannes de Silencio tells us, what ethics, both secular and Kantian, would forbid. The major thesis of this paper has presented two possible ways of responding to the charge of exclusion and the challenge of religious partiality in Kierkegaard's works of love. By questioning and attempting to redefine the necessity for a command to love, and by suggesting that the royal law could be presented in secular terms by being explained simply as love's law. What I would like to be able to say to Brodie in terms of the problem of exclusion is that Kierkegaard's call for equality in works of love is merely historically grounded in Christian doctrine, and that ultimately he's arguing for a universal form of love. But the findings of the overall analysis suggest that this is not the case. This brings me to the final section of the paper, the minor thesis. The overall and the minor thesis is solving and resolving the tension and the paradoxes that come to the surface in Kierkegaard's works of love. The overall analysis has argued for the possibility of a universal reading of Deliberation 2, A, B, and C. Deliberation 3, A, and B, however, makes such a reading impossible. This is because here Kierkegaard tells us that while love is a matter of love fulfilling the law, which is exteriority, it is also a matter of relating to God, interiority. So contrary to Kant in Works of Love, Kierkegaard also sees love as an inward matter of conscience, which means relating to God inwardly or personally. The idea of inwardly relating to God is a way of knowing him either through an intuitive understanding of the moral principles or through a personal experience of God's eternal love, both of which God is the source. It's through eternity's change, the reclamation of the Spirit's love or infinite or unrestricted form of love, that love is now a matter of conscience, as an inward relation to God, as well as an outward display of God's love. Deliberation 3, A and B together make it clear that neighborly love is not only an outward relatedness to all others, it's also inward or individual relation to God. And this is where Kierkegaard well and truly parts company with Kant and the supremacy of exteriority in Works of Love. According to Kierkegaard, God's command to love the neighbor entails the loving duty that all people are treated by us to respect due to an equal before God, the outer manifestation of love. However, this duty, as becomes clear in 3b, also entails a loving personal relationship with God as the outward manifestation of love. It also entails a personal relation with God as the inward manifestation of love. So the Spirit's love, which flows from the wellspring of eternal love, is not only the origin and sustainer of my desire to love all people, which also entails myself, but also the source of my need to relate personally or connect inwardly with God. Deliberation 3a, love is fulfilling the law, and B, love is a matter of conscience, together expand upon the theme of Deliberation 1, which is the tension between what is hidden and what's revealed, or inward and outward action, which can be understood as loving God and the neighbor in an inward and outward manner. Kierkegaard states in Deliberation 3b, in order to determine what love really is, it begins either with God or with the neighbor. But if we want to think of a starting point in Christianity's doctrine of love, the point is impossible to fix in a circular motion. In the concluding pages of the second series of Works of Love, Kierkegaard states that to love human beings is to love God, and to love God is to love human beings. So it seems that either way you are loving God and the neighbor. The question that the paradox of circular motion raises is this: is Kierkegaard's call for equality and loving practical acts of love the call to realize our ethical duty as human beings to love all human beings equally? Or is it the call to realize our duty as a Christian to move beyond ethics to discover our relation to all others through our relation with God? Deliberation 3 in Series 1 leaves us struggling to understand why Kierkegaard does not ultimately reveal the paradox of faith that interiority is superior to exteriority, as it's stated in Problema 2 of Fear and Trembling, as a solution to the dilemma presented to us in Deliberation 3, A and B. Works of Love also leaves us to struggle with the implications of commanded love, along with Kierkegaard's ambivalence towards Kantian ethics, his affirmation of the universal nature of Kant's concept of willing the good, and his rejection of what he sees as Kant's attempt to reduce faith and religion to the confines of reason. Just to finish up, in Two Forms of Love, the problem of preferential love in Kierkegaard's Works of Love, Siobhan identifies another ambiguity in Works of Love, which she outlines as Kierkegaard's ambivalence towards preferential love. That is, his condemnation and affirmation of the special relationships that we all have in our lives. Christian argues that there is an evident tension between the different attitudes Kierkegaard expresses in Works of Love with regard to preferential love. And throughout the course of her article, she addresses this tension and explores the possibility of resolving it. Contrary to Christian, I do not see Kierkegaard's ambivalence towards Kantian ethics as something that I have to resolve. Nor do I interpret the dilemmas, paradoxes, tensions that rise to the surface throughout the course of works of love as oversights, omissions, or inconsistencies that need to be amended by me. I do not see Kierkegaard as forgetful or neglectful by leaving us with an insurmountable dilemma by the end of deliberation 3A and B. Whilst this paper clearly shows that I too can see the benefits of reading works of love and Fear and Trembling, my claim is that to turn to Fear and Trembling or any other pseudonymous work for absolute solutions to the tensions and dilemmas that arise throughout the course of the first series of works of love would be going against Kierkegaard's first and last declaration, as it's stated in the final pages of the concluding unscientific postscript. And secondly, in my view, it defeats the whole purpose of works of love. The frustration that we feel by the end of works of love is the way that Kierkegaard wants it to be. As an ethical work, and because he wants to show us that even a Christian form of ethics can go no further than beyond reason, Kierkegaard therefore can go no further in deliberation B than to leave us with a paradox or a rational dilemma, and thereby leave us in a state of Socratic aporia. As was already stated, the question that the paradox of circular motion raises, the two questions it raises is one, is Kierkegaard's call for equality and loving practical action towards every neighbor in works of love, the call to realize our ethical duty as human beings to love all human beings equally? Or is it the call to realize our duty as a Christian to move beyond ethics, to discover our relation to all others through our relation to God? The paradoxical nature of Kierkegaard's ethics of love as it is presented in works of love leaves us questioning ethics or religion, exteriority or interiority, neighbor or God, universal or individual, inclusion or exclusion. So where do we go from here? Well, I believe that it's not for me to decide as the researcher of this study. It's really for me to decide as a single individual. Thank you very much.